Hello grade 9s and welcome to this video in which we will be taking a look at exponent law number 2. Now this is the law that tells us what to do when we are dividing powers. Very important is that this is part 1 of 2 videos, so please make sure to watch the second video as well. Grade 9s, very often I find that when learners are first introduced to this law, they struggle with it quite a bit, but I would like to encourage you to persevere, to keep watching these videos and practicing until you get it right. Believe in yourself and also be patient with yourself. Let's hop into it. In order for us to understand law number 2 as best as we possibly can, it is helpful for us to be familiar with the definitions that you can see displayed to the right-hand side of your screen. The first one reads that 1 over x to the positive n means exactly the same thing as x to the negative n. Grade 9s, basically what we are saying here is that if you have a term in the denominator that you would like to move up to the numerator of a fraction, you can do so. But when you do so, the sign on the exponent changes, in this case, from being positive to being negative. The definition at the bottom right-hand side of your screen reads, x to the positive m means exactly the same thing as 1 over x to the negative m. Here we started off with a term in the numerator of a fraction. And again, we can move this term from the numerator to the denominator. But we are saying that if we do so, then the sign on the exponent changes from being positive to being negative, or vice versa. Now that you're familiar with these definitions, let's take an in-depth look at law number 2. Law number 2 says that when we are dividing powers that have the same base, we subtract exponents. When dividing, we subtract exponents. So here we have x to the power of m divided by x to the power of n. The base is the same, the base is x. The answer is therefore x to the power of m minus n. A different version of the same law reads that when we divide x to the power of m by x to the power of n, we end up with 1 over x to the power of n minus m. We have simply subtracted exponents because we are dividing powers that have the same base. Now grade 9s, you would use the first version when you would like to work in the numerator. We use the definition on the right to move x to the power of n up into the numerator, and that is why we end up with x to the power of m minus n. And we use the version at the bottom when we would like to work in the denominator. We use the definition on the right-hand side to move x to the power of m down into the denominator, and that is why we end up with 1 over x to the n minus m. Both of these are different versions of law number 2, and we will now look at a few problems in which we will apply this law. The first problem says, simplify 3 to the power of 8 divided by 3 to the power of 5. Leave your answer in exponential form. This simply means that you should not use your calculator, and instead you should make use of the exponent rules and show all of your workings. I will be making use of the longer method to solve this problem, but there are some steps that you are allowed to skip, and I will point these out at the end. Firstly, we are dividing powers that have the same base. So that means that we will be making use of law number 2. We notice that 3 to the power of 8 has the higher exponent, and we can therefore use the definition to move 3 to the power of 5 up into the numerator. We then end up with 3 to the power of 8 times 3 to the negative 5 over 1. The sign on the 3 to the power of 5's exponent changes because we moved it from the denominator up into the numerator. Now we are multiplying terms that have the same base. So we know that we must use law number 1, which says that we should add their exponents. We then end up with 3 to the power of 8 plus negative 5. But 8 plus negative 5 means exactly the same thing as 8 minus 5. If we simplify this further, we end up with 3 to the power of 3. And this is in fact the final answer because we were instructed to leave the answer in exponential form. Now the first step that I wrote down is often unnecessary because law number 2 says that when we are dividing powers that have the same base, we can simply go and subtract exponents. The second problem says simplify x to the power of 4 divided by x to the power of 7. Here we are dividing powers that have the same base, the base here being x. And we know that when we do so, we make use of law number 2. But since I would like to reinforce all of the definitions and laws that you have learned so far, I will be using a longer method than you normally would. We start off by identifying the larger exponent, which here is 7. We therefore would like to move x to the power of 4 down into the denominator. We want to do this because we would like to end up with an answer that only contains positive exponents. If you end up with an answer with negative exponents, it simply means that you have not simplified as far as possible, and you will need to simplify a bit further to get your final answer. So now we end up with 1 over x to the power of 7 times x to the power of negative 4. The sign on the exponent went from positive 4 to negative 4 according to the definition that I introduced you to. We're now multiplying powers that have the same base. And when multiplying powers of the same base, we know that we use law number 1, which instructs us to add exponents. This brings us to 1 over x to the power of 7 plus negative 4. But 7 minus 4, or 7 plus negative 4, means the same thing as 7 minus 4. So we can simplify this further, and we end up with 1 over x to the power of 3. This is the final answer, and sometimes I find that learners are tempted to go a step further and say that this is equal to x to the power of 3. But grade 9s, this is not true, so please be very careful. If the 1 is in the numerator, it should stay there, and you should show it in your final answer. Again, I have used the long method of simplifying this expression, so if you would like, you can skip the first step that I wrote down because it is in fact unnecessary. Grade 9s, this brings us to the end of this first video on Law 2. In the next video, we will be looking at more expressions and we will simplify these expressions by applying Law 2. I look forward to you joining me in that video.